Thank you very much. Hi, everyone. It's always very tough to come after Balji, especially since I actually do have a PowerPoint presentation. So I'm also terrible at doing PowerPoints. Luckily, I have Joel and my team who's much better than I at this. So if it looks good, it's all credit to the team. I have, before I get into the presentation, I do wonder about the term fake news. I think it's an oxymoron because I was always brought up to think that news is supposed to be truth, right? Fake news is an oxymoron. It definitely wasn't created by Donald Trump, but it was popularized by him, weaponized by him for his own aims and objectives. And having spent a lot of time in the media industry, looking up to Balji is a guru for a lot of us. I think the way that the media is structured, and again we can talk about this during the Q&A, plays a very important role in what we are dealing with today in terms of mis and disinformation. As a show of hands, how many of you think that mis and disinformation is a problem in general? How many of you think that is a problem for Singapore? Much less. It's still there. I think one of the challenges we face is that Singapore has not really been a target of concerted disinformation campaigns. And when we don't have a clear and present danger, it's very easy to be lulled into a sense of complacency, what Balji was saying, assuming that Zhenghu, the government, will take care of it, right? So we don't really have to do very much. I don't want to spend too much time on the broader issues of fake news, disinformation, or misinformation. I wanted to focus a little bit more on a particular aspect of it, which is the closed groups, closed chat groups. And then, of course, during the Q&A, I think we can talk a little bit more about broader issues. I just wanted to do a very quick introduction of who we are. We are actually a market and social research agency. We didn't set out to be fact checkers or to run fact checks to counter disinformation. But when we started out in 2018, we realized that actually from trying to understand what was flowing in the public space among Singaporeans, there was a lot of what was then popularized as fake news. And I think what was a bigger concern for us was that the number of people who were sharing these sort of fake news indiscriminately in closed chat groups, in their open platforms, on digital media, was very significant. And we felt that as responsible citizens, if we see something, we should say something. So we decided to launch a fact-checking platform. And the aim, again, as what Balji was talking about earlier, was to create a culture of emotional skepticism among people, to get people to think a little bit more before they hit share, hit send, or hit post. And at the same time, the kind of fact check work that we did was, I wouldn't say simplistic, but it's quite straightforward in the sense that we want it to be accessible to everyone. So if you go through our fact checks, we list out how we do it. We use open source tools, reverse image search engines, and of course those very sophisticated tools, Google and Wikipedia, as a first cut to get to some of the truth, and then we sort of cross-reference with different sources as well. So anybody can do it, but we still do it because if people are busy, this is a neater way to do it, but we hope to try to build this culture going forward. We also feel that the threat of mis and disinformation is transboundary, right? Dr. Omer and I were talking a little bit about this. They don't respect borders. Fake news that starts in one country, if it's relevant or pertinent, it will flow very, very quickly thanks to the digital space. So we actually created the Asian Fact Checkers Network, which is a network of Asian fact checkers throughout. We focus primarily on Southeast Asia, but we have friends in countries like Taiwan, which faces some disinformation threats. India, which is a hotbed for disinformation and misinformation. We also are trying to build up capability sharing, experience sharing, so that we can level up the quality of fact-checking in this region. Not through our own expertise, because as I said, we've only been around since 2018, but through sharing of best practices and experiences in different markets as well. We talk a little bit about disinformation and misinformation. Does everybody know the difference between misinformation and disinformation? I don't see a lot of nodding heads. Misinformation is falsehoods, false information that is created and generated with no ill intent. So if you all know uncles or aunties or grandparents who tell you that, oh, if you hang an onion by your kitchen window, right, COVID won't come into the house because the onion will absorb it. And then they said that the evidence is that the onion turns black over time. I said the onion turns black over time because it's rotting, because you've left it there for a few days. Right, so that's misinformation, and I think throughout the period of the pandemic, we've seen quite a lot of that. Disinformation is falsehoods that have been created specifically with ill intent to achieve particular objectives. And that's what POFMA and deliberate online falsehoods was one of the working titles when the Select Committee was looking at POFMA issues. So it's deliberate and it's falsehoods generated to get people to think a certain way, act a certain way to achieve whoever's spreading the disinformation objective and aims. So good for us to know this because they're both dangerous, but one is more insidious than the other. So I think we've looked a little bit at the pandemic. Valji has touched on it as well, and I do agree it's been a huge impetus for people to start thinking and talking about fake news, because every other day we hear some other bit of crazy information related to the pandemic. The Onion was one example. In the early days of the pandemic, people were sharing cures for COVID-19, and one of it was you must drink boiling water because the virus will reside in your throat and the boiling water will kill it. Yes, but it will kill you at the same time. So we've done, I think, almost close to 600 fact checks now. In the early days in 2018, there was a lot of fake news surrounding the establishment, the government. Right, before POFMA sort of clamped down, it was, it was an unending spewing of different types of complaints or stories, rumors about politicians and government figures. And the start of the pandemic, it switched very quickly to COVID-related stuff. Cures in the initial phase, how to prevent it. Then it came to concerns about the vaccination, and then now it's concerning boosters. And in recent weeks, it's sort of died down a little bit, but CNA 938 is very kind to give us a radio slot every Friday when we go out to talk about our fact checks of the week. And this morning, one fact check was on vaccination and whether they cause heart problems for teens, for young people. They referenced a study from one of the universities in Bangkok, and they completely misrepresented the statistics to make it sound like, 30% of young people who take the vaccine will develop some heart problems, and 1 in 3 will have very severe cardiac arrest or damage to the heart lining. So even today, when the threat of COVID is coming down, we're still seeing these kind of issues popping up quite often. And they pertain to a lot of other different issues. The other fact check that I spoke about this morning was about electric vehicles and whether in the state of California, if the entire car population switches to electric vehicles, the electrical grid system cannot support. So they want to get people to be a bit worried about, if we all switch to electric cars, then houses won't have enough electricity. I can imagine that it might be the gas car companies wanting to spread that kind of issues. But we've seen, everything from terrorist groups, IS, who use fake news very, very effectively to recruit. I've mentioned a little bit about political actors wanting to smear either side, Donald Trump, for example. And up to today, COVID issues and even climate change are still a subject of quite a lot of disinformation as well. So people have spoken about the infodemic, right? The information pandemic that has sort of come around the same time as the COVID-19 situation has swept around the world. So we've seen a lot of activity in social networks for sure. The issue that Balji raised, the speed at which information is shared, the lack of any sort of filter, editorial guidance or oversight. People can share whatever they want, whenever they want to. We have seen that the pandemic in and of itself has created some very useful conditions for disinformation to spread, or misinformation, because it's new. Right? I don't think any of us have lived through something like this in our lifetime. So people were wondering what's going on. They were very concerned. There's a health and safety issues. So we started to see this and misinformation generating both confusion and insecurity among the general population. And this was, of course, pertinent to the topic of well-being and wellness in general. Now, we wanted to focus a bit on Telegram because as an example of a closed chat group. Now, if you see stuff posted on open platforms, it's easy to see, it's easy to analyze, and if you wanted to sort of counter it, you could. You can post your own comment, or the health authorities might want to say something about it to say that it's not exactly true. Now, if it's circulating in closed groups, how many of us here use Telegram today? Okay, oh, that's quite a lot. WhatsApp? Okay, even more. There are definitely many, many more platforms, but we wanted to zoom in on Telegram a little bit. WhatsApp has certain restrictions on how many people you can forward information to, how many times you can do it, and how many people can be in a chat group. Telegram is a little bit different. There are newer ones, of course, Signal, Mega, that come out as well. But we want to use Telegram as an example. It's hard to track and, of course, know why people are spreading certain things on any chat group, including Telegram. And the pandemic has definitely made people emotionally vulnerable. And obviously people are scared, worried about the health issues, worried about things like vaccination and boosters. And when they search for information to calm themselves down or to reassure themselves, they become more prone to mis and disinformation. Because, as I sort of said, it's hard to tell where the sources of information are. And at the same time, and I'm not a psychologist, but in terms of understanding how people think, in times of confusion, in times of high level of fear and uncertainty, people tend to become a little bit more, they flock to things that make them feel reassured. So if you find a group of people who sort of agree with your bias, agree with your own inherent positions and perspectives, it gives you a sense of reassurance. And if you go into a space where there's a lot of, either confusing views or differing views from what you are looking at, it heightens the confusion and the sense of insecurity. So people tend to be drawn to echo chambers, to silos, where they feel that they are among friends who agree with them. And that seems to reassure them emotionally, which then again makes closed chat groups very, very dangerous in our opinion. So talking about echo chambers, of course, as you might imagine, if you are in an echo chamber that's closed off from very diverse or differing views from different sources, you tend to have a very limited perspective. And it gets more and more limited the longer you spend in a closed chat group. And this, of course, can be very dangerous if you're dealing with a situation that's fast developing, like the pandemic, like geopolitical issues, security issues. And if you don't have that diversity of views, there's a huge danger that you end up following things that are not necessarily true, and you can't develop a complete picture of the world. If you see some of the chat groups, which I'll share later, you'll realize that the members and the people who run the chat groups tend to only think in one particular way, and they just keep reinforcing it again and again among themselves. They look for evidence that backs up their views, and they disregard any evidence that disagrees with their views. So when you have a closed group like this, it becomes exponentially more dangerous for society. Another impact that we see is that because you start to feel a sense of solidarity with your group, by definition, people who are outside your group are the others, right? There's a line drawn between us and them. We know what's going on. They obviously got it wrong. So, we'll ignore them, we'll block them. If anybody tries to share a difference in views, we'll shut them down and say that you're wrong, you're stupid, you obviously don't know what's going on. So Telegram, just for those of us who, I see a lot of people actually use Telegram, it is encrypted, and the server-side encryption ensures privacy for group members. Your phone number is not required, so it generates greater anonymity compared to, say, WhatsApp, for example. There's a high limit on media sizes, so what you can share videos, you can share a lot more lengthy content. No limit on message forwarding, so you can, it's quite user-friendly in terms of sharing content from other platforms as well. So Telegram, as a case study, is a little bit worrying for those of us who are concerned about the spread of fake news. Oh yeah, you can have chat group size of up to 200,000, right? Which is a little bit scary as well. So There are a few Telegram groups that we actually sit in. We are all quite silent observers because we want to see what people are talking about and whether we need to fact check anything. I'll run through a few. There's Healing the Divide, and I guess everybody might have heard of them. The founder got into some legal issues. They have more than 5,300 members. You have other groups, smaller ones, the Fight Infectious Disease group. You have Fight COVID-19 Asia. And then you have suspected vaccine injuries, and that's quite significant. That's 13.5K members, which is not insignificant. And there's a COVID Lakopi group, which is quite amusing, but it's also significant, more than 11,000. So the danger with these sort of things is that it's not just the sizes of the people in the groups, it's also who they share it with, their family members, their friends, and there's an amplification effort. If you think about the numbers here, it's quite significant, right? And they're very active. There's stuff being shared all the time. Now, if I go into disinformation in the closed groups, I think one of the narratives or one of the positions that forms is that, in this group, we are all the smart ones. We are the other people outside are the sheep. We are the enlightened ones, and we know better. So this tends to reinforce and build up people's resistance to different types of information, potentially more diverse information. They will say that, government control media, I cannot believe, right? Donald Trump called it the fake news media, so that must be it. And, I think one of the dangers that we've also seen is that a lot of the disinformation cited inside there have no sources. It's some weird platform from the US or somewhere in the West. If you look in these groups, you would think some of them are actually Trump supporters with the way that they accept, Fox News stuff as opposed to any other source, for example. Studies are reposted from unverified sources, or as I shared in my example from the radio show this morning, they will cite sources, but then they will misquote or misrepresent as well. So these are some of the examples of the issues that we have seen. This is some of the quotes that we see, right? I remember reading about propaganda in history books and thinking, wow, this is so obvious, nobody would fall for this today. Boy, was I wrong. So basically saying that, I'm enlightened, and everybody else who believes this sort of thing, then they don't believe it. You have things like natural news. This is the one that we debunked this morning, which is the study that found 30% of teenagers develop heart problems after getting the second dose of the vaccine. Completely misquoting the study, by the way. And then they say that, most people are not thinking, they don't realize that there are more COVID cases after the jab, so that's a sign that, the jabs actually don't work, and all this stuff about the variants is nonsense, is BS. And I'm sure many will continue to swallow this information. So that's the kind of sentiment, and these are actual views that we have extracted from the chat groups, right? So, broad issues. I think one of the things that we bear in mind is that there's still value in groups, in communities within society. The sense of community that is provided, especially during the time in COVID where people were stuck at home, couldn't go out, there is a bit of a communal aspect where people feel a bit less isolated and more connected to people. But as I sort of said, that there is a lot of dangers there. And that there are bad actors who are consistently feeding these groups with mis or disinformation. And it's tricky to think about how they can be kept in check. Because by definition, a closed group you cannot see unless you're inside. And some of the groups are very selective with who they allow to come in. If you start to say anything that runs counter to what they are trying to say, they'll kick you out straight away and they'll ban you, right? So if you have moderators who are sensible, obviously they have the responsibility to moderate it properly. If there are other members in the group who are daring enough to say something when they see, something that's wrong, they should, but it's an uphill task, right? Either get kicked out or people leave your group and go to somewhere else where their views are reinforced. So very quickly, what could potentially be done? You could create groups to counter the disinformation. So people who are looking for information are not only sucked into or drawn into one side of the narrative. We do a lot of work, as I said at the start, to encourage information literacy. We do some programs with the National Library Board. They have the SURE program, which is aimed at encouraging young people to think a little bit more critically about information and the media as well. This is all part of building a more digitally resilient population. And at the same time, if we see things getting out of hand in terms of extremism and misinformation on Telegram, whether you guys are in the groups or it's the work that we are doing as fact checkers, if you see something, you should say something, rather than just keeping quiet and say, oh, it's not really my problem. It is a societal issue as well. That's all. I think I kept to within my time limit, and of course, happy to discuss during the Q&A. Thank you.